Hi, everyone. This is Don Leland with Edge Management Consulting in Seattle, Washington, and you're listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast with Frank Hernandez.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. This is Stephen Van Tassel of WildLife Control Consultant, bringing you information on how to manage vertebrate pests in your business and practice. Wanted to talk today a little bit about euthanasia and being humane. Frank told me that I could really be geeky, so I'm going to get a little geeky on everybody here. This is one of my passions and something I'm going to be talking about a little bit at the next Pest World in Florida coming up here in October of 2018. A lot of wildlife control operators and pest control people, I find, don't really use terms as technically accurate as they want. And so sometimes it can lead to confusion between what you're meaning and what your client is hearing. Now, sometimes that confusion can be to your benefit because that way the client thinks you're doing one thing and you're thinking another, but you're not necessarily lying to them because you're not trying to deceive them. You're just meaning two different things when you're talking to each other, and that can be an advantage at times. But other times it's, in my opinion, deceptive because you're trying to exploit that difference purposefully and trying to get a halo effect. And I'm talking here about what the word humane and euthanasia means. So let me give you a little information about how those terms are understood. So when we're dealing with the word humane, there are basically two ways to understand what that word means. The first way is that we're acting in a manner on behalf of the animal's interest. That means we're doing something like we're trying to get into the head of that particular animal and say, how are we behaving? If we were that animal, would we want to be treated that particular way? It's sort of like a challenge on the golden rule, where do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So you're trying to get into the head of that animal and saying, is my treatment of that animal something I would want if I was that animal? Now, let me explain what that would mean. So if the animal got hit by a car and was basically suffering on the side of the road, and you saw that the injuries to that animal were beyond recovery, if you were an animal, would you want to have someone put you out of your misery, or would you want to someone just leave you there and let you die of your injuries? Well, I think most people would say, hey, I'd rather be put out of my misery if I was that animal because it would end my suffering sooner. Well, that's one definition of being humane. But there's also another definition of humane, and that definition means acting in a manner that limits the suffering that we cause an animal. Now, understand how that's different, because it sounds the same, but it's not the same. For example, being humane under that definition would mean I'm going to kill that mouse, but I may not be using a glue board to do it. I may be using a snap trap because a snap trap will cause that animal to die faster than a glue board. Whereas in the first definition, you couldn't say you were humane because you're not really acting in the interests of that mouse, because the mouse would say, hey, I don't want to be caught in the first place. Now, why do I bring this up? Because a lot of people don't understand the position of the animal rights movement Because when they come on TV and they say, hey, we need to be humane to animals, what they mean by humane is different than what, say, a hunter means by humane, or a wildlife control operator, or a pest control professional. They're two different things, because an animal rights person says, look, that animal has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of its own happiness. Where a wildlife control operator says, no, that animal has the right to a certain level of respect, but it doesn't have the right to life. The landowner, the property owner has a right to have a pest-free home. And so we have this clash of ideologies and worldviews here. So when we need to talk about being humane, that's why it's understood in different ways with different people, because they have different concepts of what that means. We often use humane for how we're treating the animal, but we're still doing it for our interest, not necessarily the animal's interest. Where an animal rights person says, no, the only way you're going to be humane is if you act on the basis of the animal's interest. So I understand that's a very subtle point, but it's often missed in our conversations. Now, why does this matter in a more practical sense? Well, let's talk about euthanasia. Euthanasia means from two Greek words that have been put together. It means good death. EU means good, and thanasia means death. It's a good death. So in modern terminology, it means dying in a way that without suffering. Well, if you look at the AVMA, that's the American Veterinary Medical Association, a lot of wildlife control operators say, look, I follow AVMA euthanasia guidelines. These are the guidelines that are published on a periodic basis from the American Medical Veterinary Association. The most recent committee meeting and publication that they have was 2013. They've been doing this, I think, as far back as 1999, I think was their first edition. So they keep changing it and revising it each time. So understand that when they talk about euthanasia, they mean that the animal must be unconscious while it's dying. It's because when you're unconscious, you can't feel pain. But they also have another aspect. They say veterinarians must consider the interests of the animal. So when wildlife control operators say, hey, I'm following AVMA guidelines, I suspect that most of them don't realize that they're only following part of the AVMA guidelines, because they're not thinking about, well, what's the interest of the raccoon that I'm cat trapping and I'm killing? Because the raccoon would say, hey, I don't want to die. I don't want to die at all. Why are you trapping me? This home is a beautiful place for me to live. Why are you bothering me? And that's not what the wildlife control operator is understanding by the following AVMA guidelines, because many people haven't read those guidelines. It's quite long and quite detailed. So we need to think about how we're using terms. And I'm not suggesting that if you're following the suggestions for how to kill an animal from the AVMA, that's fine. But what I'm saying, we need to be careful when we say we're following AVMA guidelines, when in fact we're not. We're following part of those guidelines. We're following the suggested killing methods of those guidelines. We're not following the full story of what the AVMA says in terms of our treatment, partly because we in America separate domestic animals, those are animals that are owned by people, from wildlife. And so we have different rules for wildlife and we have different rules for dogs. As I tell people, you can shoot a raccoon, you can't shoot your dog. At least not in most areas of the country. Why? Because that would be considered, shooting your dog would be considered cruel, because domestic humane laws are different than what the laws are governing our treatment of wildlife. Now here's where the political issue gets crazy. And that is a lot of animal control officers, a lot of humane societies, animal welfare groups, animal rights groups are trying to pierce the veil, the legal distinction between domestic animals and wildlife. And so they're trying to use the laws that govern the treatment of domestic animals and say, hey, you need to be using those same principles in how you're treating wildlife. So if you can't drown your dog, that means you can't drown a raccoon. Now, there have been various cases where people have been brought up on charges for how they treated wildlife, and they've been brought up on charges under cruelty laws based on domestic animal use. This is a complicated issue, and we'll be talking more about this in future podcasts to be sure. However, I want all of you to understand that when you are killing an animal, follow these rules. Number one, never, ever, ever, to the extent humanly possible, ever kill an animal in public view. Don't video it. Don't put it up on YouTube. You need to take that animal to your shop if it's legal for you to transport it. But if you're going to kill that animal, it needs to be killed out of public view. You make sure you don't get into that situation. We had a situation in Connecticut where a gentleman was following Connecticut law. Connecticut law said if you capture of rabies vector species, he had a raccoon, which is a rabies vector species, took that animal to the edge of a pier. People asked him, what are you going to do with that raccoon? And he says, well, the law says I have to kill it. And he tossed it off the pier. $6,000 later, the charges of animal cruelty were dropped against him. Now, that gentleman did nothing illegal, but he still had to pay $6,000 out of his own pocket for legal bills to defend himself for something he never should have defended. Now, I would suggest that it was a mistake. It showed poor judgment, in my opinion, of killing an animal in public view. Not that it's illegal, but because many people take animal treatment to heart. And we need to be sensitive to their fears and concerns. Nevertheless, this is something we need to learn from. Don't do this. You may squash cockroaches and ants all day long, and you may get your clients laughing and all kinds of things. Things are different with wildlife. Don't believe your client when your client says, I don't care what you do, get that animal out of the house. I've had too many situations in my own career where people have said, they would tell me that, and as soon as I had the squirrel in the cage, the first question out of their mouth is, what are you going to do with it? Notice how quickly people change their mind. It's almost schizophrenic when the situation is under control. Be careful. Don't just simply believe your client. Oftentimes they say things when they're under stress that they would not say when that animal's in the cage. So be careful. Always make sure. So number one, never, ever, ever kill an animal in public view. Even if it's legal, avoid it at all costs because we want to be sensitive to people and you don't need the public relations nightmare. Number two, always think about how you're treating that animal when you're in the killing process. One of the things we have to be careful of in our business is we can get cavalier with how we're killing animals. And it's a dirty business. It's an ugly business. The fact of the matter is sometimes we get inured to the doing this, and we get a little lack of compassion. And I'm not telling you to be crying on your dashboard when you're killing an animal. No. That's not. It's an animal. It's not a person. It's not your grandparent. It's not a human. Okay, I don't believe that humans are animals. But nevertheless, it does deserve our respect, and we need to be sure that we're treating animals appropriately. So be careful how you're tossing the cage around. Don't put different species together. Like if you have a raccoon with a squirrel and the squirrel can see the raccoon, that's very stressful for the squirrel because that would be prey. It would be a prey species. So be careful. Try to make sure you're not euthanizing animals in view of each other. And you want to make sure things are calm and quiet. You want to keep animals relaxed before they're being killed. Don't let them watch other animals die. That's not appropriate. If you're going to do a little video time with the animal just to prove to people that you caught it and that sort of thing, keep that activity to a minimum and then understand that that animal's being stressed. Being an animal caught in a cage is extraordinarily stressed. It's lost its freedom. It's lost its ability to defend itself and hide. So when you're doing show and tell time, minimize that activity as much as possible. Show the kids, yeah, here's Mr. Squirrel, here's the raccoon, whatever. I'd be careful of humanizing them too much. But the idea is it is an educational opportunity and people are interested. However, keep that time minimal. Don't extend this up for multiple minutes. Be compassionate to that animal and try to do your best to kill these animals quickly and responsibly. In the future podcast, we'll talk about the difference between euthanasia and humane killing and different methods on how you can do euthanasia or humane killing, because they're different and the difference matters. I'm Stephen Van Tassel for WildLife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.